Hey folks, so I wanted to talk about something that comes up an awful lot on photography forums and photography Facebook pages, which is a very common question. What's the best lens for my camera? Now, that is a very hard question to answer. In some respects it's an understandable question, but in many respects it's a really silly question. Because the way cameras are designed is they have interchangeable lenses, and each lens excels at different genres and different types of photography. However, stick around, because at the end of the video I am going to recommend you your first lens if you're very new to cameras, or you maybe just got the kit lens and you want to get another lens. So I do have a recommendation, but first let me go through the different kinds of lenses. And I thought we'd start with something that I like doing, which is wildlife photography, and let's start with super telephoto lenses. So here is a super telephoto lens. Now that is a 100 to 400mm lens. Now I'm going to talk about lenses on APS-C cameras, which is predominantly what I shoot. I do use full frame, and where applicable I will give you the conversion to 35mm format. But these are all Fujifilm lenses, but the vast majority of amateurs who get their first camera, if they don't get Micro Four Thirds, will get what's called a crop sensor camera, APS-C, and this is what this video pertains to for the most part, the typical amateur photographer camera. Now, a 100 to 400 lens is great for photography if you like doing wildlife. That's just my cat down there. And it's got a range of 100 to 400mm, so it's very good at zooming in and getting detail on subjects. Now, as we talk, I'm going to bring up odd sample photographs of what you can expect with this type of lens. And I predominantly use mine for bird photography, and I mostly use it at 100mm. Sometimes I'll use it at, what did I say, 100mm? I will mostly use it at 400mm for wildlife, and occasionally I might use it for some telephoto landscapes at focal lengths in between, maybe anywhere from 100 to 400. So you have some limited landscape type photography you can do with this lens. You can sort of do portraits with it, but you'll struggle for sort of wider shots where you want to see an awful lot of the scene. It's a very bespoke lens for a very specific purpose, and its main purpose is to excel at the telephoto end, taking pictures of birds, squirrels, whatever you see fit, and wildlife. But it has a secondary nature of being able to do landscape and some very, very unusual portrait shots, but not a normal focal length that you'd use. Now, there is another type of super telephoto lens that you can use, and it's far more versatile, but its caveat is it will not be as specialised. So the lens I've just shown you is what's called a red badge lens on Fuji, which means it's their sharpest lens. It's incredibly sharp, detailed, resolves great detail, and it's very expensive and it's very heavy. This is because with wildlife shots you essentially want a very sharp lens. Now, you can get a lens like this. As you can see, it's a lot smaller. And it's also a super telephoto lens. In fact, it's arguably more of a super telephoto because its range is 18 to 300mm. But the downsides is that in order to become that small, it doesn't let as much light in, and the lens elements are not quite as good quality, but the compromise is that it's really lightweight and easy to carry around. And if you're not looking to do, if you like, more professional level shots, then you could quite happily get away with a lens like that. And the advantage about a lens like that is that it's called a general purpose lens in some respects. It can do everything, but it doesn't excel at any one thing. That's why it's general purpose. You know, it can do portraits, but at f6.3, when it starts to zoom in, it's not going to get that lovely shallow depth of field, as you can see when I move close to the camera, because I'm on an f4 lens at the minute. And the depth of field, as I move closer, I can get a much shallower depth of field with that much wider aperture. I'm not going to go into detail about how aperture works, but for want of a better word, the lower the f-stop, f4, f2, f1, or f1.8, very common sort of lens sizes, f2.8, the lower the number, the wider the aperture, and the softer, as I move closer, the shallower the depth of field, which means the more blurry the background is. And so a general purpose lens like that is not going to do well at portraits. It can take portraits, but it's not going to be great. It can do wildlife, but it's not going to be as sharp, and the autofocus isn't going to be quite as good because it's not got that top-notch autofocus and sharpness that the more expensive dedicated wildlife lenses have. It's more general purpose. It could do landscapes, and it can do landscapes quite well, but again, it's not as sharp as a dedicated landscape lens, and because of its big zoom range, you can sometimes get distortions, things like vignetting, which is darkening of the corners. So the corners are here. They can darken with vignetting, and that's often common on lenses of that type of an 18 to 300 range. The longer the range, the more optical compromises. That's not to say these can't be corrected if you do editing, but a lot of people who do photography don't wish to do editing. Some of these things are corrected in camera, but it's not perfect. And I've taken some good landscape shots with this lens, but I've seen that it can be quite soft in the corners when it's wide open at 18mm. So it's not ideal, but if I'm climbing up a really steep mountain and I don't want to carry a 2kg lens with me that's dedicated to a certain task, and I want to have something that's general purpose, then I might consider taking a lens like that and compromising on the optical quality. So, but we still haven't got to the end to see what my recommendation is yet. Now, moving on, we've got what we would term medium to standard telephoto lenses, and I've got one down here. I've picked the wrong one up. It's this little weeny lens here. So this is it's a Sigma lens, but Fuji make an equivalent, and it's a very common focal length, and it's the classic 18 to 50mm, or on a lot of cameras it's 18 to 55mm. In fact, with Fuji, it is 18 to 55mm on the Fuji lenses. And this covers all the classic lenses. Now that was an f2.8, and often these lenses are f3.5 to 5.6, so it can vary depending on the lens you get. But if you pick up an f2.8 version of this lens, which are really still quite cheap and considered kit lenses, it's going to be reasonably good at portraits. Because it's not such a big zoom, it's going to be reasonably good at landscape photography, because it can go relatively wide. It's not going to really do really well at wildlife or anything that needs telephoto. And it is going to be still limited in portraits because some portraits require a much longer focal length, 75mm, 105mm. A lot of portraits work really well, especially for upper body shots, with a much more zoomed in medium telephoto look. There's one lens I can't really talk about much because I don't have one in this focal range, which is a very common focal range, which kind of fits in between the lenses we just talked about, the telephotos, and the short telephotos which we're talking about now, which is a medium telephoto like a 50 to 140 or a 55 to 200. And you can think of those like a halfway house between what we've talked about at the start, the super telephotos, and what we're talking about now, which is the short telephotos. You know, they can do some landscape photography because they can go quite wide at about commonly 50mm, which you can get some really nice mountain shots. Often if you're in the mountains, you might well use 50mm as a focal length. It produces some nice, pleasing shots, you'd be surprised, because a lot of people assume that to do landscapes you need ultra-wide lenses. You don't need an ultra-wide lens to do landscapes. It's just the type of landscape you're doing. But these lenses are certainly quite versatile. Now, moving on to the last type of zoom lens, we have this. And this is your ultra-wide. This is an 11 to 20mm Tamron lens. And again, it's an f2.8, but again, once you're at this level of lens, you tend to get quite fast apertures. Some of them are f4. Fuji do their own f4 version of that, but Tamron do an f2.8. Now, they're nice and sharp because they're dedicated to that wide angle photography. 11mm is very wide angle, very unique kind of look, really good for, you know, beach shots where you want to emphasize, you know, the shoreline and maybe the water lapping on some stones, or you've got some beautiful rocks that are leading up to a picture of a lighthouse or something. They're very good for shots like that, wide lenses, because that 11mm can really emphasize the, you know, the foreground of the image, whereas still having, you know, something in the background. But at 11mm, your subject is going to be quite small in the frame, but equally you can go into 20mm, but you're still only just into the focal range of the standard telephoto lens. So again, these wide lenses are very handy. They're not going to be great for portraiture. They can sometimes work for street photography, which again your medium telephotos can as well. But again, wide lenses tend to distort things, especially when they're at their widest. Things don't look quite right because the human eye doesn't see as wide as a wide angle lens. So the lines look rather elongated towards the edges of the frame. If you've got a lot of lines, you'll get them leaning in. So they're great for architecture, showing interiors of buildings. If you're doing street photography and you want to capture people, but you also want to capture the environment around them, they're very good for that. What comes next? Well, we've got what's called prime lenses. Now, prime lenses are just a single focal length. This makes them very small, very light, and very, very sharp, and often they're very, very fast. They have a very wide aperture for their size, which means they're very good in low light, but of course they can't zoom. So you would have something like this, which is the 56mm f1.2 from Fuji, which is superb for portraits, but it's a very, very specific lens. Because it can't zoom, it's got no flexibility, and it pretty much is suitable for portraiture. That's it. You can do other things with it. You could do some landscape, but it wouldn't be a lens you'd want to necessarily put in your bag because it would take up the space of a more versatile lens. But they're very, very sharp. And you can use, you know, you could use it for wildlife if you can get close enough, but the reason you have those long telephoto lenses of 400mm is because you can take a picture from far away and you don't disturb the wildlife, so you can capture it naturally in a natural situation. And primes, of course, come in different focal lengths. That's a 23mm. That would be ideal for street photography, small, discreet. It's an f1.4, so again, it's super fast. So, but it's a wider focal length, but it's perfect because it's equivalent to 35mm full frame, and around 35 to 50mm is a very pleasing focal range for the human eye, because it's roughly the range we see things in real life, which is why 23mm on a cropped camera is a very, very common format. But because it's small, it's very discreet. And lastly, we have a final type of prime lenses, which is the little cute pancake lens. You can see they're tiny. And these are for where you want to be super discreet. That one you saw there is a 27mm, not quite as fast because it has to compromise on optical quality. It's not quite as sharp. And it's an f2.8. It doesn't have quite the number of lens elements, so they can suffer from flaring and things like that because they don't have all the extra fancy elements that some of the other lenses do. but it means you can put your camera in your pocket because it's that tiny when it's attached to the camera. So essentially that's all the types of lenses, but next we've got to sort of decide what I said at the start, which is what's the best lens to get for your camera when you don't give a reason. So what is the best lens? Well, I'm going to give you three choices. I'm going to give you one for full frame, and I'm going to give you two for APS-C. And I know I haven't talked about full frame, but we're filming this on a full frame camera. And taking into account what we said, probably the best, most versatile lens you can use on a full frame camera is a 24 to 105mm. That's roughly a 16 to an 80mm on a cropped sensor camera. Now I don't have a 16 to 80, although Fuji do one. And there's probably our equivalent on other camera makes. But I digress. I think this is a very versatile focal length that I very commonly use because it's small and light for full frame and relatively fast at f4. It can't do everything, but it can do a lot of the types of photography I do well because it's a medium telephoto. So that leads me on to what lenses would I pick of all these ones I've got now listed in front of me. Well, my first recommendation, and you've probably already got one of these, is your kit lens. Now if you want to upgrade your kit lens, you couldn't do better than looking for the f2.8 version of it. So you'll probably have an 18 to 55, f3.5 to 5.6. So if you're happy with that focal range and that's all you feel you need, and you've been able to take pictures you want, but you want something that maybe works better in low light, you want to take some portraits, then you can't do wrong with getting a lens like that. And if you want a very general purpose lens, you want to get this, something like an 18 to 300, which will let you do all the genres we've talked about. Those two lenses cover all of the genres we've talked about. They won't excel at them, but they'll do everything. You'll be able to do portraits, landscapes, some architecture, but not everything to do with architecture because you're not ultra wide. The only thing those two lenses don't cover is ultra wide. But hey, you could also get a 16mm prime to cover that. But as you can see, there is no perfect lens. What I'm trying to tell you is that there are lenses you can get, but you'll have to compromise on what you can do with them. But if you're not sure, and you just do photography for fun, you probably wouldn't be able to go wrong with similar lenses to these two, which will cover pretty much everything you need to do. Now, if you want to do something more specialist, you want to do the ultra-wide landscapes, you're going to need something like the Tamron 11 to 20. You want to really specialise in bird photography, you're going to need at least a 100 to 400. You want to do mountain photography, you'll probably want a 50 to 200. You get the picture. There isn't a perfect lens for everything. There are always compromises. So I'm hoping that what I've said, even though it isn't a concise answer, does answer what a lot of beginners ask of what lens do I get, when that's the only question. What's the best lens for my camera? Because I see it so many times, and I think that's the only answer I could give. But what I'm really trying to say is, think about the photography you enjoy, think about the lenses I've talked about, and then decide what kind of lens you need. And then start looking at those lenses. Because that is how you really choose a specific lens, what you want. But bear in mind that all lenses are compromises, which is why we have interchangeable lens cameras. There are, as we said, lenses that are very good at doing a lot of things, but they all, at the end of the day, have their caveats and can struggle. So, if you got value from the video and you enjoyed this little talk, then drop a like and subscribe for more videos. And I will catch you all later, folks. Bye.